Good evening. Welcome to Prairie Lights. I'm sorry that more of you didn't come. It's just Thank you all for coming. I'm Wendy Levenger, and tonight I'm very pleased to present Bennet Sims and Carmen Maria Machado for a reading from and conversation about Sims' new short story collection, newly published by $2 Radio. This new collection, Other Minds and Other Stories, is an American Booksellers Association Indie Next Pick for December 2023. Of the book, author Mauro Javier Cardenas says Bennet Sims belongs to that almost extinct category of fiction writers whose lexical virtuosity, besides being a joy to read, reminds us the English language can thrive outside the tired phraseologies of everyday life. Whether he's examining glitches of intersubjectivity or the generative power of blank faces in a sarcophagus, his obsessive inquisitiveness enlivens every page of Other Minds and Other Stories. And author Tony Tulatimote says, Bennet Sims is a pioneer and peerless master of psychological horror. The characters of Other Minds and Other Stories are haunted by intellect, helplessly coaxing terror from the ordinary by their powers of fine observation. GPS navigators, text messages, a snowy night, even the very act of reading. But what's truly unsettling is that once this book makes you see things in its brilliantly paranoid way, you'll never be able not to. Glory to Bennet Sims. Sims is also the author of the novel A Questionable Shape, winner of the 2014 Bard Fiction Prize, and finalist for the Believer Book Award, and the short story collection White Dialogues, which was named a Best Book of 2017 by Book Forum. Sims was a recipient of a Michener Copernicus Society Fellowship and winner of the Rome Prize for Literature, 2018-2019. His fiction has appeared in A Public Space, Conjunctions, Electric Literature, and Tin House, as well as others, as well as in the Pushcart Prize anthology. He has taught at Bard College, Grinnell College, and currently at the University of Iowa. He is a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop and will be joined in conversation by fellow alum Carmen Maria Machado. Carmen Maria Machado is the author of the short story collection Her Body and Other Parties and the memoir In the Dream House. Her essays, fiction, and criticism have appeared in places such as The New Yorker, The New York Times, Granta, Vogue, This American Life, The Believer, and Guernica. She has been the recipient of numerous awards and fellowships from places including the Guggenheim Foundation, Yaddo, Hedgebrook, and the Malay Colony for the Arts. She is currently visiting associate professor of fiction at the University of Iowa. We are very glad to have them here. First, please welcome Bennet Sims.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. This is quite overwhelming. I was telling Carmen, with whom I came to the workshop a little over a decade ago, that I see faces from many different strata of my life here, which is very moving. So thank you for coming. Carmen has requested that I read one story from the book in its entirety. It's called Pecking Order. I will say that I'm teaching two classes this semester. One, a class on writing animal minds, writing about non-human consciousness, and the other, a horror class, which includes units like torture and body horror and so on. This story would fit on either syllabus, and so it is about butchering chickens, and I dedicate it to all of the students from those classes, past and present, who I see in the audience tonight. It'll take me about 25 minutes to read. And then I'll be in conversation with Carmen, and then hopefully there's time to be in conversation with y'all, and then I'd be happy to sign books and stuff afterward. But yeah, I will just dive in. The story is called Pecking Order. It fell to Kyle to kill the chickens. On Saturday before dawn, while Audrey was still asleep, he put on an old t-shirt and jeans and headed out to the coop in the backyard, hedge clippers in hand. It was a cloudless, cool morning, and though the horizon was still dark, the hens were already up and clucking. All three were making the warbling underwater sound that meant he was late letting them out. The coop was a shed-like wooden trailer with mesh windows along the sides and a hatch-style door in back, where a 2x4 gangplank dropped down to the ground for the hens to file in and out on. Theirs was the only coop in the neighborhood. The yards to either side were furnished with barbecue grills and bird feeders, and he scanned the porches for any sign of the neighbors sipping coffee at their banisters. The yards were empty, the windows dark, no witnesses. The chickens had been Kyle's idea. He and Audrey had rented the house after college and had treated it as a laboratory for locavorousness. They kept a garden in the backyard. They could walk to the farmer's market. When they absolutely needed to go to the grocery store, they biked to the Trader Joe's in black tracksuits at midnight before garbage day, cleaning the dumpster out back for plastic clamshell containers of wilted salad mix, expired Odwalla juice, and 6-pack cartons of cracked or otherwise compromised eggs. Back home, they tested the eggs by dropping them one after the other into a pot of cool water. Half usually buoyed to the surface like witches, and of the unrotten ones on the bottom, one or two would discharge venereal-looking driblets of white albumin from invisible fissures in their shells. One weekend, after every egg in the batch bobbed rottenly, he started browsing Craigslist for coops. He and Audrey had never owned a pet together, but he was eventually able to talk her into the idea, on the condition that he assume full responsibility for the chickens. And for the past few years, with the help of YouTube tutorials and farm FAQs, he had. He woke early to feed them and biked home at lunch to check in. He taught himself to raccoon-proof the coop. Soon he and Audrey had enough eggs in the fridge to cook frittatas every weekend, and they hadn't paid a single dollar to the region's overcrowded, groundwater-polluting poultry farms. But sometime this past winter, their little micro-flock, almost simultaneously, as a group, had quit laying. And although Audrey had cajoled him into keeping them for a while, as pets, there was no point putting it off any longer. Last month, he had been accepted to law school, and at the end of summer, they would be heading east. Since they couldn't bring the chickens along with them, the time had come to slaughter them. Audrey knew of a good butcher at the farmer's market, but it felt cowardly paying a stranger to do what he could do just as well himself, here in the backyard, where at least the chickens would feel at home. The YouTube how-tos made it look straightforward. He searched the garage the other day and found the hedge clippers in a corner. Technically, they belonged to the landlord, but he planned to bleach them afterward. When he showed the clippers to Audrey that night, she frowned and ran an appraising finger along the blades. Weren't they too rusty, she asked? Too dull? If he was going to do it himself, she didn't want it to be painful and inhumane, she said. He did not ask her, who had done nothing to help care for the chickens, when she had become such an expert in butchering them. He just nodded thoughtfully. What did she suggest? She went to the kitchen and dug their toolbox out of the pantry, handing him their wood-handled hammer. Not a sledgehammer or a mallet, just the dainty claw-headed thing he destroyed his thumb with, hanging up picture frames the weekend they moved in. It looked about as deadly as a plexer. She didn't appear to be joking. In defending the clippers, he proceeded to mock the hammer, maybe too meanly, calling it the poultry Mjolnir, destroyer of coops, and asking her how many painless, humane hammer blows she thought it would take to knock a squirming hen unconscious. By the time they went to bed, he thought he'd sold her on the clippers. But the next morning, while they were both at work, she texted him links to butchering tutorials on YouTube. The same videos, naturally, he had already looked up himself. He skimmed through them again on mute to humor her. 3-minute clips of rosy-cheeked men in overalls cheerfully demonstrating different instruments of death, which range from industrial-grade machine-whetted cleavers and hatchets to, yes, mallets. but the most impressive of the videos displayed what seemed to be a motorized garroting gadget. A noose of steel wire protruding from a white plastic housing, which, with the push of a button and an evil mosquito-like whine, would begin to reel the wire in, cinching it tighter and tighter around a chicken's throat until, inexorably, within seconds, the head would pop free on a parabola of pressurized blood. As he skipped around in the video that morning, it occurred to him that all that the high-tech device was doing was basically what a pair of hedge clippers would. It was the same principle in the end. Incremental constriction, scissors physics. If they could clip hedges, they could clip heads. He said as much to Audrey when he got home. As long as I don't have to see it, she told him. Holding the clippers now, paused on the plank of the coop, he was trembling with what he recognized from high school football to be adrenaline. He had never killed an animal before. He had never even been in a fist fight. Was it legal, actually, to be slaughtering livestock in a residential backyard in plain sight? He'd been afraid to Google it. What if the neighbors saw? What if their children did? What if they called the police, or PETA, or Audrey? He gave the clippers 2 quick, neutering snips in the air. They were the heavy-duty pruning kind, with long bowed handles capped in green plastic, and with 2 curved blades that clamped together in a tight metallic beak. They would probably be fine. Everything would be fine. He just needed to squeeze fast and hard on the handles, apply enough crushing pressure to their necks. It would take seconds. He would be back in bed before daybreak, and later this afternoon he and Audrey would be defeathering the carcasses and roasting them for the big goodbye potluck they had invited everybody over for tomorrow. Normally, they would never serve meat, but it would be a way of honoring the chickens, they had agreed, to share them with friends, to make of them a meal that had been raised and loved locally, and killed with compassion by the very same hands that cooked them. It had seemed then, and still did seem this morning, like the most dignified death he could offer the animals. Leaning the clippers against the coop, he stepped into the dim interior, where he was assaulted by a wall of straw odors. The chickens were huddled together on the roosting shelf, their small, sharp, funnel faces all regarding him with their left eyes, the far-sighted, predator-seeking eye, as he approached. He petted each in turn before scooping up Simone. He told himself that he had picked her first at random, but the truth was that he was expecting her to be the easiest, emotionally, to murder. She was, alone among their flock, if not among her race, an appalling bully and greedy sociopath. Within the first month in the backyard, she had managed to grow twice as fat as the other 2 chickens by aggressively gobbling down their share of feed. And in the time since, she had enforced her primacy in the pecking order with psychotic ruthlessness, jabbing Hannah and Judith with her beak, clawing at their eyes, ripping the tail feathers brutally out of their bottoms, sometimes without even the provocation or the pretext of food to compete over, just for the sake of humiliating them, which sadistic displays of dominance he had often watched with rage from the kitchen window. He had read that feather pecking might be stereotyped foraging behavior, and that providing stressed or anxious hens some litter to peck at was supposed to help. But he had added litter to the yard, and if anything, this had only made Simone torment Hannah and Judith more, jealously driving them away whenever she noticed them pecking at it. It was no use complaining about any of this to Audrey, who doted on Simone, and sometimes let her ride her shoulder like a parrot. She's just a chicken, she chided him. You can't get mad at her. This after the incident last year, when he'd caught Simone mounting Hannah in the yard and snapping at her eyes. The only way he could think to get Simone off her was to make an empty fist around some phantom feed and go tss 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 while jerking it, as if calling her to peck pumpkin seeds from his palm. Food was the only bait more tempting to that little hobgoblin than blood, and sure enough she dismounted Hannah to waddle hungrily over to him. When she was within kicking distance, he punted her back. The betrayed yelp she made, it was a sound he had never heard a chicken emit before or since, had the same mewling, pseudo-human quality that kicked dogs are capable of. Audrey, who had been watching this for God knows how long from the kitchen doorway, shouted his name across the yard as sharply and shamingly as if the chicken had been their child. Just a chicken, she had said to him then, and he had never understood what she meant. Parrots could count. Crows could not only remember human faces, but bear grudges against them. Who could say what Simone was thinking? If a chicken could think, it could hate and be hated. If Simone could think, he could get mad at her. But if she could think and feel pain, he also couldn't kick her, he knew. He had apologized and told Audrey she was right, and given Simone one of Audrey's hair ties, one of her favorite toys. But even though he had only ever lost his temper like that the one time, both of them, Audrey and Simone, had kept a cool distance from him for days afterward. Now, though, as he held Simone in the crook of his arm, she seemed at peace with him. She let out soft begawks, scrabbling gently at his forearm with her talons as he carried her down the plank and grabbed the clippers with his free hand. He had taken her out of the coop hundreds of times on days just like this one, and if she had detected his apprehension, if she intuited by the sight of the hedge clippers or the firmness of his grip that today was going to be any different, she did not try to flee. She trusted him. Holding her tight, he crouched down in a bare patch of dirt and positioned her between his knees, squeezing them together to pinion her wings. At this, she did seem nervous, growing still with fear, and he effortfully effleuraged her comb to calm her. Then he collared her neck with the hedge clippers, no doubt sparking some species memory of a fox's jaws. She blinked rapidly and cocked her head at acute, confused angles, the way she always did when encountering a strange or novel object, weaving around it in the grass to investigate. She was trying to see her death, too, with each eye. He squeezed the handles. The blades glided deeply through the meat at first. Sooner than he had expected, he heard the home-run crack of what he assumed was a vertebra being snapped. But then the blades got caught on something and locked up. Simone spasmed between his legs, thrashing her head, and he had to wrestle with the hedge clippers like a steering wheel to steady her. A jet of blood spurted wet warmth across his forearms, shirt, and face, and, wincing, he pressed his knees together, waiting for Simone to fall limp. He listened to the drawn-out sound of her begawks, which soon elongated into deafeningly shrill, ear-splitting screams. They sounded to him almost like human screams, like the unmistakable scream of the murdered at their murderer, which must sound the same, he thought, no matter what creature is screaming it. It was as if this death rattle could adapt itself to the anatomy of its victim, emerging as a single sound from any throat, such that when murdering a chicken you'd hear the same curse against you as when murdering a person. At this thought, it occurred to him that Simone's banshee begawking was liable to wake Audrey or the neighbors, and he scanned the surrounding windows, all still dark. Simone's throat's blood, which had spurted upward at first, appeared to be losing pressure. It cascaded down in a single sheet, darkening the feathers of her belly and muddying the dust at her feet. The blood loss alone was enough to kill her, eventually. But she did not stop spasming or screaming, and now the other two chickens had started shrieking alongside her from the coop. Hannah and Judith had pressed their faces against the mesh window, and as they watched their sister's execution, they beat their wings and bawled in unison, driven to a state of choric frenzy by the gore. The sound of their voices must be what was encouraging Simone, for she kept kicking her legs in a futile attempt to flee, as if trying to run back to them. Her talons clawed the ground, scarifying the dirt with a series of scared parallel lines. This was impossible, he thought. She could not still be alive. He counted to 10 out loud, as though disciplining a child. If you're not dead by the time I get to 10. And when Simone continued to struggle, he understood that she was not going to die, not if she hadn't already. Not only had he failed to decapitate her, he had failed to even sever a vital artery. His breaths became tight, and it was as if it were his own throat between the blades. As if his future, this necklace of inevitability and dread, were constricting around him now. He had no idea what he was doing. That much was becoming clear. What if Simone refused to die? Even if her head came off, she might find a way to live, like that one sideshow chicken who'd survived 18 months beyond its decapitation, thanks to a protruding snorkel of spinal cord that had preserved its brainstem. Simone, too, could lead a half-dead, headless, heedless life like this. Audrey would insist that he care for her, pipetting corn kernels into her neck stump with an eyedropper. And Simone would no doubt hang on indefinitely, haunting him like a Doulahan. He tried squeezing the hedge clipper's handles again to drive the blades in deeper, but almost immediately he met a grisly resistance. The blades were being blocked by an obdurate bedrock of muscle and bone. He waggled the handles in panic, clenching them until his fingers ached, and he felt the same frustration and rage as he had in kindergarten arts and crafts, whenever the dull blades of the hateful safety scissors would get stuck in some uncuttably thick piece of construction paper. felt like throwing a tantrum, like flinging the clippers from him. He relaxed his grip and breathed. There was no use losing his temper. He needed to kill Simone as quickly and as painlessly as possible. His mind raced through all the myriad ways of killing Simone. He imagined stomping on Simone and stabbing Simone. He imagined punching Simone and kicking Simone. He imagined prying up one of the garden's flagstones and using it to bash Simone. Above all else, he needed to put Simone out of her misery, and it didn't matter how he did it, just so long as he did it soon. Every second that he wasted was another second of unspeakable suffering for Simone. Every second that he kept these blades buried in Simone was another second of barbaric torture for Simone, far worse than anything she would have had to endure at a factory farm, where at least death was mechanized and mass-produced, designed to minimize fear, pain, and discomfort, with the hens likely locked into metallic leg restraints and dangled upside down from a shackle line, whose motorized belt would convey each of them to a water-stunning bath to dunk them under, one after the other, submerging their heads for the precise time it takes an electric shock to knock a squirming hen unconscious, before raising the limp, oblivious birds and gliding them toward the private compartment at the end, through the flap of black plastic that blocked their view and baffled sound, beyond which a pair of pneumatic scissors would, with a hiss of air, snip their throats above the spill trough. Even Simone deserved a death like that. He pulled apart the handles until the blades unstuck and threw the clippers to the ground. Blood poured freely from her neck, where the opened wounds made two thin dark slits in her skin, like gills. Dizzied by the sight of the blood, he reached down with both hands and grabbed her head, wrenching it as far as he could to the right. He had only ever seen spies or assassins snap necks in movies, and they always made it seem as clean as this. You gave the head one orthopedic, orthogonal twist to the side, and there was the sudden Foley effect of crunched ice. Except this did not happen with Simone. When her head hit the outer limit of cervical rotation, it simply stopped, grinding to a halt, and she made some kind of awful, drowned, burbling sound, still fighting to breathe through the fluids filling her throat. His hands were slippery and syrup-colored with the blood that was choking her. He could barely feel anything through the sopping feathers. He knew he needed to hyperextend her head by another few inches if he wanted to kill her, but the more forcefully he tried to torque her spine, the more nightmarish her burbles of pain became. Her squawks were now arrhythmic and hiccupy and horrifying to hear. This only made him more impatient to snap her neck, so he started swiveling her head back and forth, jerking it left and right in energetic bursts. It felt like jiggling the knob of a locked door, as if he were trying to open the door to her death, only to find it locked with life, dead-bolted against death by the unrelenting cylinder of her life. With every jerk, he felt the dumb stubbornness of her skeleton, the brute anatomical fact that a neck doesn't want to be snapped. What was wrong with him? Why couldn't he snap this neck? It was only a chicken's neck. He had snapped curtain rods and kindling thicker than this neck. The harder Simone resisted, the more he began to resent her. Why wasn't she cooperating? Didn't she understand he was doing her a favor? She was fighting death with the same viciousness with which she had bullied Hannah and Judith. Yes, of course, that was it exactly. The gluttonous little shit was as greedy for life as she was for feed, and now she was bullying death out of his fair share, competing with him over every last grain of sustaining oxygen. She was trying to establish a pecking order over death. Even a chicken understood that death was inevitable, that it was preferable to die quickly rather than to prolong the agony. But Simone was prolonging the agony anyway. She was probably drawing out the agony just to spite him, ruining her body for consumption. He thought with bitterness of all the cortisol and adrenaline that were doubtless even now flooding out of her brain and into her bloodstream, tainting the meat with the taste of her terror. With every second that she didn't die, more and more mortal horror was leaching out of the cortex and into the meat. She was only growing more acrid with each protracted, nociceptive second that passed. The flesh of her breast was becoming a kind of telltale heart against him, contaminated with that telltale tartness. And he could already picture Audrey at the potluck tomorrow, screwing up her face in disgust and discreetly spitting out sour white wads of Simone into her napkin. Simone managed to get a wing free from between his knees and began flapping it, as if waving to Judith and Hannah for help. And this somehow made her neck even stiffer and harder to twist. He released one hand to wipe the slippery blood off on his jeans, and she took advantage of his loosened grip to dart her beak blindly at him, biting into the web of skin between his thumb and forefinger. He hissed at the sting and flapped his hand, shaking the pain out of his perlicue. And to keep Simone from fleeing, he squeezed his knees even tighter against her sides, so tight he thought he felt a rib breaking. Good. Let her rib break. Let all her ribs break. She wanted to fight dirty, fighting death. She wanted to enforce a pecking order. He would show her how high up on the pecking order he fell. He was a primate, a linebacker. He used to bench 300 pounds. He hunched over her, clasping his hands around her skull. Without allowing himself to think, he yanked up on her neck with all his strength in a single whole-body motion, as if trying to clean and jerk a feathered kettlebell. As he rose, her neck stretched elastically with him, but he kept her torso pinned below, between his knees. He felt more than heard the silence that resulted. All at once the air became dewy with quietness, which was the sound, it took him a moment to realize, of Simone not screaming. She had stopped burbling and begawking and clawing at the dirt, and this was how he knew, as he kept rising, that her head was about to tear loose from her body. Her head tore loose from her body. There was a wet, ripping sound. The word ligaments flashed into consciousness. And then there was no more resistance to be felt. He was yanking with all his strength on nothing, on absence and air, and the upward momentum sent him staggering backward. He steadied himself just in time to see Simone's decapitated torso topple over, her throat stump pumping dark blood into the dirt with little systolic burps like a discarded garden hose. He averted his eyes, glancing down at his hand, but what he saw there was even worse. His fingers were still clutching, had forgotten to drop Simone's head. Her beak hung open in a soundless shriek, like some muted Orpheus, and her left eye was staring right sightlessly at him. Without thinking, he flung the head away from him, and it bounced across the grass like a skipped stone before rolling to a stop beneath the coop. There it landed, looking up at Hannah and Judith, who started squawking in hysteria. They are in hell, he thought. They must think that they have woken up in hell. He glanced down at the hedge clippers, which indeed looked demonic in the aftermath. The heavy blades were greased with blood, brown feathers and flecks of bone splattered across them. And he wasn't even done with them. He was only 1/3 finished. At this thought, all the strength drained out of him. Judging by the milky light boiling over on the horizon, he had only an hour or so before the neighbors woke, and in that time he needed to take care of both Hannah and Judith and hose off whatever extra blood and brains their respective death throes would have succeeded in spraying across the yard. He needed a break before he could face it, a glass of water. Turning to the house, he saw Audrey at the kitchen window, pale and stricken. Christ. He lifted his shirt above his stomach to rag away the blood on his cheeks as he approached the back porch. She was standing in the doorway when he got there. "Babe," she said. That was awful. He couldn't tell by her tone whether she was accusing or commiserating. "I cut at the wrong angle," he explained. He shook his head in self-reproach, and even as he did so, he recognized the gesture from other goof-ups, other mechanical misjudgments, like the time he had tried to fix the chain on her mountain bike or assemble their sofa. "I threaded the chain wrong," he had said then, shaking his head, or "I screwed this rod in backward." He had just cut at the wrong angle. It's not like he had relished ripping Simone's head from her body. One day this would all be funny. "I told you those hedge clippers were too dull," Audrey said. "What you need is that hammer." And she went inside the kitchen and headed for the pantry. He followed after her, glancing down too late to confirm that his bloody boots were tracking Simone across the linoleum. He'd mop up before the potluck. "There's nothing wrong with the clippers," he said. He could overhear the petulance in his voice. But it was absurd to blame the clippers. If they could cut through a branch, they could cut through a chicken's spine. Except that a branch doesn't struggle or fight back or scream. "I just need to cut higher up on the neck," he said. Audrey still had the same pale, stricken look on her face, and it was as if she were seeing him 5 minutes in the future, ripping Hannah's head from her body. No, even if the hedge clippers did get stuck again, he wouldn't have to fight with Hannah or Judith, not as he had with Simone. She had long since packed a submissiveness into them, had disciplined them in advance, and they would know to go docilely into death. They would file into its depths as obediently as they were used to waddling down the coop's back plank, especially after what they had just witnessed. Still, to placate Audrey, he joined her in the pantry and rooted through the toolbox. He held up the hammer. Worst comes to worst, he told her, popping the air before her face. She flinched. Do you want me to help this time? She asked. He shook his head, and she did not bother concealing her relief. She went back to the window, where he knew she would be watching. It will be fine, he said, and he believed it. If the hedge clippers failed to decapitate the chickens cleanly, all he would have to do is take the hammer in hand and, as mechanically as if he were cracking crab shells, deliver 1 or 2 taps to their skulls. Swift, painless, humane. They wouldn't even have time to scream. And if the hammer didn't work? On his way out the door, Audrey touched his shoulder, he assumed to encourage him. But when he leaned in and kissed her cheek, she reflexively raised her fingers to the spot, as if brushing away a lipstick imprint of blood. Thank you.
Thank you for reading that. I'm going to ask this question a lot of order because I actually want to talk first about something that I think does not get talked a lot about with your work, or at least not as much as it should be, which is how funny you are and what a funny writer you are. That story is tremendously funny. So yeah, I was wondering if you could talk about your relationship with humor and how you think about sort of the role of humor in your work, and also like in horror and like horror adjacent work, which I think is also like a feature of your work as well.
Oh, thank you. So yeah, I think about that story structurally in terms of escalation. Like before the reading, Sam Chang, who we both worked with at the workshop, described it as an escalatory story, and that things just keep getting ratcheted up and become more and more horrifying. And so I think some of the comedy in the piece is structural, that this difficult situation is becoming more and more unbearable as the story goes on, which is also the structure of a skit or a gag or a joke that you escalate. You take an absurdist premise and then just keep tweaking it higher, and then also subverting someone's expectations of where it might go with the next escalation. I also think about escalation stylistically, like a prose stylist who I'm really influenced by is Thomas Bernhard, this Austrian novelist who writes cute. I solicit any other hoots for Bernhard. Who writes these really misanthropic, bitter, ranting narrators. His novels are usually just like 200-page block paragraphs with no chapter breaks or indentations, and it's just the internal monologue of someone who hates everyone around them. And the thing that these characters hate are often highly exaggerated, and the humor comes from the exaggeration, and the escalation comes from the sentences, which are like really repetitive and recursive, and circling around these same phrases that he keeps repeating. He calls himself a master exaggerator, and he thinks of exaggeration as being his art, and stylistically it's a source of the humor. And he's also someone I was thinking about with some of the repetition and the stylistic escalations in this story. So even the way there's that long paragraph where Kyle is thinking about all the ways to kill Simone, and his mind just gets caught on the phrase, he could use X to kill Simone, he could use Y to kill Simone, and just starts plugging different positive contents into that syntax in this way that gets syntactically escalated. So yeah, I think about humor in terms of there's narrative structure and escalation. I think about it at the line level, and then I also think about it in terms of character, because like obviously the premise of this story is pretty simple. It's that like someone who has an idea of himself as being a good, humane person like walks face first into that idea, the way that a bird will fly into a glass window. And he realizes the limits of his own goodness in this difficult situation, and actually, despite his best intentions and best self-presentations and self-narrativizations, discovers that he has this like dark, angry, violent side of him that's being brought out in this encounter, because this chicken will not let him give her the good death he had planned for it, and like she will not let him be the good person in this conflict. And so yeah, I think of a lot of the humor in this piece as being character based, that it's about a character who has an idea of himself and is then testing the limits of that idea.
So this is your second short story collection, and I noticed there's a lot of like pairs of stories in here, or stories that seem to like feed into each other or reference each other or reflect each other or echo each other in some way. So can you talk a little bit about the process of putting a collection together? You know, obviously this Other Minds being sort of the central sort of question or sort of mode of interrogation you're using in these stories. Like, can you talk about, like putting a collection of this together, like how you thought of it structurally as like a complete book?
Cool, thank you. Yeah, so there were stories that I didn't think of as being narratively linked, but as I was writing them, I realized that they were thematic or even stylistic twins. So I have one story, the title story, Other Minds, which is about a character called the Reader, who is reading like an e-reader, like a Kindle, and seeing all the sentences that other people have highlighted. Like 600 people have underlined this sentence, and he's trying to project himself into those other readers' heads. Like, why did they underline that
They're
sentence?
the worst sentences.
Yeah.
On the page.
They're sentences that he finds quite unremarkable. Like, they're not the sentences that he would underline. And so that story has this line, like, all his life, if you had asked him why he read, the reader would have said he was curious about other minds. I was also working on another story called Introduction to the Reading of Hegel, which also features a character called the Reader. This one is a graduate student in a philosophy program. He's applying for prestigious fellowship, and he's trying to do theory of mind with the judges he imagines will be reading his cover letter. So he's like, who will be reading my project proposal? What kind of philosophers do they like? Who do I need to have read to impress this person? And he's trying to project himself into their head. And I didn't think of these two characters, both named the Reader, as being literally narratively the same person. Like, I didn't imagine that the Reader from Other Minds would enroll in a philosophy program and become the Reader of Introduction to the Reading of Hegel. But stylistically and formally and thematically, I understood that these stories were siblings to one another. So like they're both written in block paragraphs, like Bernhard. They both have this character called the Reader. They both have similar sentence styles and modes of thought. And once I realized that, I took that line from Other Minds. All his life, if someone had asked him why he read, the Reader would have said he was curious about other minds, and I put it in Introduction to the Reading of Hegel to sort of tease out their twinship and make explicit the fact that they were echoing and interrelating with one another. And then just to return to your question about like the larger structure of the collection, I also was thinking about where to put them just in terms of table of contents architecture. And so I do have them sort of one in the first half of the book, the other in a symmetrical position in the back half of the book, so they mirror each other across the collection. There are other stories like that, like the first and last story are these two single paragraph ekphrastic pieces that I wrote in dialogue with a photographer for Friends Images, Chase-Jung Nicholas Leong, and he graciously allowed me to include those photos in the book, and so the book opens and closes with two stories that are twins to one another. And then once I had that architecture in place, I started seeing that stories that I hadn't thought of as being twins actually were. So I have one story called Unknown, which is a horror story about technology where someone starts getting creepy unknown calls on his smartphone. And I have another story called The Postcard, which is also a horror story about technology, about someone being led into a strange landscape by like an automated GPS device that's like turn left in 50 feet, so the destination is on your right, etc. So when I realized like both of those stories had a lot in common thematically, and also both had stylistic echoes, like both play on the phrase "do not disturb," I also put them in symmetrical positions in the structure of the book to sort of make explicit the ways in which they are mirroring one another.
I actually sort of want to, sorry, I have a question about technology and about art, because you have a lot of the ekphrasis in like images in this book, or phrases. Oh, sorry, I'm like not even talking to my microphone, sorry. So yeah, there's a lot of like use of images in this book. And yeah, what is your relationship with like writing off of or about art, or like pictures. It was just like a really, I mean, you in your last book too, you also had, I mean, I don't think they were in the actual like printed book, but when you did the story White Dialogues when Electric Literature published it, they actually published these like animated GIFs from Vertigo, right, that like reflected like what was actually happening in the story. So like, what is your relationship with these images and art?
Thank you. Yeah, so I mentioned Bernhard, another German language author who I think about a lot is W.G. Sebald, who is also a fan of Bernhard and is coming out of Bernhardian tradition in certain ways. But one thing he does that Bernhard doesn't, Gesundheit, is include lots of images in his books, and he does that to trouble the distinction between fact and fiction. So he'll have a book that pretends to be a travelogue. Like, I went to this town and I met all these people, and here are these like black and white photographs of the people I met, but they might just be fictional characters who he made up, and those photographs might just be images that he found at flea markets and then Xeroxed a bunch of times to make them even more grainy and seem more authentic. So he'll use images to authenticate the existence or factualize the existence of fictional characters and situations, but he'll also include kind of historically authentic images, because importantly he's an author who's like engaging with the Holocaust and documentation of the Holocaust and literature of witness and things. So he'll also have characters of real, or photographs of like real Holocaust survivors or journal entries or whatever. And crucially, you never know which ones are fictions and which ones are factual. So he'll also have like diary entries that he just wrote out by hand, and he photographed the journal and said this belonged to this survivor of the Holocaust. And he sort of acknowledges this project in a really beautiful way in one story, in The Immigrants, where a character, a Jewish character who has witnessed a Nazi book burning, is upset that there's no photo documentation of it. No one took a photo of the book burning, but he knows it really happened. He knows it exists. This atrocity exists. So the way that he documents it is by getting a photo of the courtyard where it happened, just an empty courtyard, and sort of collaging in black smoke. So he uses a forgery and a fiction to document historic truth. And the act of forgery and fiction making is what creates this negative space for communicating historical truths. And Sebald includes that photo sort of as an ars poetica for the reader, like how we are to read all the images in his books. That like when he has an image of someone that could be a fictional character or could be a historical person, the very ambiguity of that interpretation and circulating between those two options ripples out and contaminates every other image in the book as well, and makes us think about genre and truth and literature's relationship to reality. So that's a really long way of saying that I don't often use photos that way. So often when I include photos in my fictions, they're much more straightforward aids to ekphrasis. So if I'm writing about Vertigo or Rear Window, I'll have screen grabs from Vertigo and Rear Window so that the reader can look at the details that my narrator is noticing. And I use images in that sort of more straightforward way a lot in this collection as well. Like if a narrator is sitting before a sarcophagus, I'll reproduce an image of the sarcophagus so that when he's pointing out details in the carving, the reader can follow his gaze. But there's one photograph in particular in the collection that I do think of as functioning in a Sebaldian way, which is a family photograph that I've included of my mother with what appears to be a specter of the Grim Reaper standing behind her. And the narrator reproduces this photo and says, this is like this haunted object of family lore, and we don't know whether this ghost is real or a glitch in the developing process or what. And I sort of invite the reader to conflate the narrator with me and to approach that photograph auto-fictionally and to assume that it really is a ghost and that I haven't just photoshopped it or collaged it or whatever. And then I invite the reader to sort of let that uncertainty about factuality ripple out and reverberate through all the other details in the story, and to wonder, like, oh, did this also really happen, or is this really uncanny coincidence or synchronicity something that Bennet invented for this narrator for the purpose of the fiction? So yeah, most of the photos in the book are just aids, visual aids to ekphrasis, and then a couple have a more ambiguous frame around them.
Can you talk a little bit about sort of like, I feel like when I read your work, there's something so, you use a lot of like cipher characters. I feel like I'm often having anxiety spirals or thought spirals like with your characters. It's a really uncanny effect that I love. And I was wondering if you could talk about like this book's explicit project of like investigating other consciousnesses and like sort of what drew you to that, like what you learned. Obviously you're teaching a class about like animal consciousness, right? So clearly this is like an area of interest of yours. If you could just speak to like that project.
Thanks. Yeah, like I think that line from Other Minds, the title story, Introduction to the Reading of Hegel, is true. I would subscribe to it. Like, the reason I read is because I'm curious about other minds, and I believe in the power of literature to reproduce or represent conscious experience in language, and that in like a certain very deep and weird way, when I read Proust, I know what it feels like to be Proust looking at a painting or a tree or something. So that is my relationship to reading as just like a human being out in the world, and my relationship to other minds and my curiosity about them. As like a writer who is primarily like a horror writer, or a writer who's interested in psychological anxiety and paranoia, I wanted to explore intersubjective curiosity in darker directions. So like I wanted characters who were wondering what other people were thinking, and their inability to know for sure became a source of stress and danger and paranoia for them. And so I sort of explore that through various permutations, like a story about a jealous lover who doesn't know who his partner is texting and wants to know what's on her cell phone, or a guy who's killing a chicken who doesn't know what the chicken is thinking and is trying to project himself into its head, or a character who is trying to imagine what it would be like to be a ghost or a snowflake or whatever. So yeah, pursuing curiosity about other minds, both between human characters, also between humans and animals, also between humans and supernatural or speculative entities, and also between humans and objects. And then yeah, I think that the anxiety in that project is just a function of my stylistic affinities, which is that I enjoy writing these kind of Bernhardian spiraling thought loops and things.
So I know you have students here. Can you talk a little bit about, you're a teacher, you've been a teacher for a while, the role that I guess, I don't know, your pedagogical practice has on your work, or the role that your work has in your teaching?
It was a very generous question, thank you. Yeah, I think that like reading my favorite work with students is one of my favorite parts of teaching. So just like giving them a story of Kafka's or Lydia Davis or whatever, and then hearing what they notice about it, and then being able to layer up this really sedimented block of attentiveness over many years. So like every year that I teach it, different students are noticing different things, and I'm taking notes, and now those are all things that I notice as well. And I think that is part of the project of other-mindedness, that like now I'm reading that work through their eyes and seeing what interests them about it. And that is certainly something that I take back to my own work. And I think the same is true of reading their work. So I think one of the beautiful things about workshop is that when an author puts up a story, the job of everyone else in the room is to get themselves inside the mind of the person who would write that story. Because often people are workshopping something that you wouldn't write yourself, and that you wouldn't even necessarily read for pleasure. But for an hour and 15 minutes, it's your job to think, like, okay, if I were gonna write like an elvish high fantasy locked room murder mystery with this set of characters, with these formal devices and this sentence style and this structure, like how would I go about problem solving in this project? And you make like a really good faith effort to kind of like spark across the abyss between like your mind and your taste and your practice into their mind and taste and practice. And I think that, yeah, that also informs the work I do on my own in ways that are really ineffable and difficult to articulate or quantify, but that I am rambling too much.
No.
Yeah. But that, to wrap up, but like I have faith in it, and like I think that's happening for the students in the room as well. And I think that is the valuable thing about writers sharing work with one another in general.
Sorry, I was just mostly trying to figure out when we were pivoting to audience questions, but I'll do one more and then, or do you want to do?
I think maybe we have time for one or two questions, if you want to take questions.
Oh, audience questions,
or
yeah.
if you can finish, whichever you
Do we have any questions from the audience? I'm also happy to.
Hey, Val.
Hey, Joe.
So we were once on this panel situation. It was awkward, and somehow the name Clarice Lispector came up, and it seemed like nobody on the panel besides you and me ever knew what that name meant. Huh?
Just a little closer.
Oh, okay. Anyway, we ended up talking about that sort of long narrative of hers where a woman eats a cockroach, which on a scale of human suffering, you know, is really not a big deal. So I was just floating that, and then I'm curious about between your beautiful prose style and your ability to mix humor with horror. Is your relationship, because horror, most people think of as a somewhat demonic and dismissible genre, and you've raised it to the level of literature, partly because you write so well, and partly because of how intelligently you handle it. But here's my question. Keep with Clarice Lispector in mind, because your details are relentless, right? And so I guess my question is your attraction to horror, not in the world, but in literature, is it an obsession, or is it something you don't feel at all?
Thank you. Thank you for that beautiful question, Jim. So I remember very well so I'll repeat the question in case people didn't hear. So he said, many years ago we had a conversation about this novel by Clarice Lispector, The Passion According to G.H., which is about a woman who crushes a cockroach in her bedroom and then gets on hand and knee, face to face with this dying insect, and has this kind of mystical monist realization that she and the cockroach are one, are made from the same matter, that like all of her disgust for the cockroach is a flaw in her thinking and a flaw in her metaphysics, and that all the surface differences between them can be stripped away, and that below those they're made of the same white paste, and she's watching like white paste ooze out of its shell as she's having all of these epiphanies. And once she realizes that, she understands that like to truly act on that insight would mean to take the cockroach inside her. And so she eats that white paste toward the end of the novel. So Jim asked me if I was a fan of that book, and I said, yeah, I love it. I teach it in my horror classes. I said, are you a fan of that book? And he just went, which I took to be a yes, and which I think about every time I teach it. I do teach it in a horror class. A funny thing happens, because we're reading a lot of really traditional horror before we get to it, like Henry James and Shirley Jackson and Edgar Allan Poe and Lovecraft and so on. And then the week that we get to Clarice Lispector, which is this really weird, difficult, demanding, dense, mystical novel, people start getting sick. Like, kind of Lispector flu goes around. And like 5 or 6 people just don't show up those 2 weeks, which is fine. But the people who stay get like the deeper Lispector fever, which is like, oh, I love this. I want to think these kinds of thoughts now. Like I want to rewire my brain like this. And so yeah, to answer your question, like that is sort of what I go to horror literature for. That like in any literature I read because I'm interested in consciousness, as I was saying earlier. And what interests me about horror literature is that it is a deeply conscious genre. Like it's about human minds in extreme states of heightened attention and heightened fear and heightened thought loops and heightened obsession. And that kind of heat in the internal monologue generates incredible poetic effects that you can sustain a novel like Passion According to G.H. with a narrator who's just in one room for 200 pages doing nothing but looking at a roach. But the sentences are so electric and the obsession is so electric that it generates all of these really, beautiful lines that I now have memorized, which I don't think is an unusual relationship to the novel. Like the translators afterwards, she also talks about just having huge passages of it by heart. I think that is something that you can get in horror that you might not get in a mode of more muted realism, where the minds are more tranquil and less disturbed on their surfaces, or less obsessed in their sentences and so on.
I think I'm going to have to say thank you now.
It's a perfect note to end on.
First of all, thank you all for coming. We close at 9, so I think it might take some time to clear out, which is why I really wish you could stay longer. On behalf of Prairie Lights, I'd like to thank you, Bennet, and you, Carmen. It was really fantastic. I'm vegetarian, and that's but I was laughing.